Blue, who's president of the Mount Vernon Genealogical Society, and Mount Vernon is our sponsor. And today we're going to talk about the National Archives. So,
Chuck, when I hear the word National Archives, and when anybody hears that word, if they're not familiar with it, it just sounds so complicated and so overwhelming. Would you just tell us a little bit about what the National Archives does?
Well, the National Archives maintains the records of the federal government and its various agencies. So, it is not really as complex as it sounds. It's not as intimidating as it sounds, but it is a little bit involved.
Does everything that's created by the government go into the archives?
No. Actually, they estimate that only about 2% of the records that the government creates in any year's time eventually goes to the archives. Agencies maintain records sometimes for years and years and years, and then eventually they start running out of space and they have to do something with them. So they evaluate and decide what they're going to send to the National Archives. And
I think one of the confusing things for some researchers is, whether or not it was a document that was created by the state or whether it was created, by the U.S. government. It's a federal document.
Yeah,
and that's a big distinction.
That can be confusing, and the records that we're talking about at the National Archives are ones created by federal government agencies. Many states also have their own archives that they keep records. In some cases with the state, it's a separate facility. In other cases, it may be both the state library and the state archives combined, which is what we have here in Virginia. The Library of Virginia is misleading. Everybody thinks it's just the library, and they say, well, where's the archives? Well, it's the archives too, also.
So, when I go into the National Archives database and I plug in a surname, I don't think I've ever gotten anything. So tell me about the records and how are they arranged?
Okay, the records are actually, and it is true, it's not a database that you can really put names into. So the way the records are arranged by something called a record group. And the record group is the way that, or a number rather, that the records are assigned when the agency first starts to send records to the National Archives. The Archives was created in the early 1930s, and I think it was 1934 when they first started receiving records at the Archives. So the record group, as the records come in, they're assigned the next number. And so the records, if you look at the record groups, it can be confusing. For example, the War Department, which is the agency that first held records for the military of the United States, and these are basically Revolutionary War records. The record group is Record Group 93. Then they have records of the Adjutant General's Office, which is Record Group 94. So they were the 93rd and 94th agency to send records to the National Archives. Now the Veterans Administration, which is a much more recent agency in its founding and its beginning of operation, is Record Group 15. They were the 15th agency to send records to the National Archives. So knowing the record group, and they have a guide, it's published in hardback in a lot of libraries. It's also downtown in the archives, you can use it, but they do have it on the website, the Guide to Records of the National Archives. And so you can look through and find the agency that you are looking for in the guide and read about the records. It tells you a little bit about how they were created, when they were created, what types of records you have. Are they microfilmed? Are they still in paper format? Are these books like ledgers and things like that? And history of the agency and all in that guide. Most of the records that people use at the National Archives are the census, although a lot of these are online, but have used in census, immigration, military records, naturalization records, land records. And so the guide will tell you, if you're looking for a court case, you'll be looking for the federal court system. So you find that record group and read about it, and that will tell you. Then when you go down there, the staff has the books that tells them where all those records are that need to be pulled. So you just need to know what you're really looking for when you go down there. You don't have to know everything from A to Z about the records.
And you can go online before you get there, because then it will tell you where it's located, because in DC there are two locations, aren't there?
Yes.
And so what's the difference there?
Well, there's the downtown location on Pennsylvania Avenue and Constitution Avenue. And of course, the side that everybody sees at 4th of July when they do the parade and all is the visitor side, where you go see the Declaration of Independence and all the other things they have on exhibit. It's the Pennsylvania Avenue side that we as researchers go into. And they have basically records of the government. The things that we use basically are what I've said: the census records, the federal naturalization records, the federal court records, federal land records, the military records that they have there basically are the Civil War through the Philippines insurrection. Then you have the other facility in the DC area out at College Park. And that basically has, for military, information about the units that the men served in for the Army, or the ships that they served in for the Navy from World War I forward. So they don't have much they don't have anything personnel-wise. They're in another facility. But they have things from or about foreign policy, fiscal policy, social issues, the Departments of Commerce, Labor, Transportation, and Energy out there. And they have a great variety of formats that things are in. Downtown, basically, you have either original records or microfilm. But out at College Park, you have sound recordings, you have still photographs, you have moving pictures, you have other types of things, you have maps, you have all those textual records that we want to get our hands on. So it just depends on what you're looking for, which facility you're going to go to, and what they're going to have.
I know that not everything is microfilmed. Will they let you look at original records?
It depends. If they are only in original records, generally, yes, they are going to. If they are microfilmed, depending on what the records actually are, if they're more fragile, they're going to want you to use the microfilm, unless there's a problem with the microfilm. They don't surprisingly have all of the census records in original format down there, but they have all of the films of the records that have. Now we have the 1890 loss with the fire that took place in the 1920s. But if you have a page that the microfilm is really bad and it's hard to read, you can get a staff member to look at that page and they will say, yes, that's really hard to read. I think we need to pull the originals, and they will pull the original records. Pension files, for the most part, although they've been scanning those and they're going up on places like Ancestry and all, the majority of the pension files are still in original records that you can go down there and use them.
When you say pension, are you talking about military pension?
Military pensions for anything from the Revolutionary War through the Philippines insurrection. The biggest ones that get used, of course, are the Civil War pension files. I think that's probably the largest collection of pension files that they have.
And boy, are those a wealth of information. My goodness, because people
yes.
had to write letters
Yes.
to confirm that that person had served, and they talk about their relationship and where they lived and what
Yeah.
their financial situation was.
If it's
wonderful.
anybody but my ancestors. What really happens with the pension files is, depending on the circumstances, my main one that I first found was for my second great-grandmother. She married her first husband. He was killed in the war. And she had 3 children under 5 years old when he was killed. So she was a fast track to a pension. There's 12, 14 pages in the pension file. But then you have other people who had to struggle and prove things. And there's where you get the big, thick pension files. Even her second husband, my actual second great-grandfather that I descend from, even his is really kind of thin. But the first time that I did one for a friend of mine, I spent over $40 at 10 cents a page getting the pension file.
Oh my gosh.
So.
Wow, lots of information there.
Yes, yes.
So I've noticed that there's a lot of branches of the archive. So
Yes.
what do you find in a regional archive?
Regional archives have an assigned group of states that they have. So there are 14 regional archives that are part of the National Archives, and they are around the country. As an example, in Boston, there is the New England Regional Archives, which is going to cover all the New England states. And then moving down the map, you have New York and New Jersey and the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. They are all housed in the archives of New York City. And then you have Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, and West Virginia, which is in the Mid-Atlantic Archives, which is Philadelphia. It's actually Montgomery County now. They moved about a year and a half ago. They have a Philadelphia mailing address, but they're actually on a street that's dividing line between the city of Philadelphia and Montgomery County. So they are there. And it depends on the regional archives, what they have. They are going to have a group of records related to the states that make up that regional archives. As an example, if you're looking for naturalization records that took place in the federal courthouses, if you are looking for them for New York or New Jersey or Puerto Rico or the Virgin Islands, they are only in original format. So you either have to write and get a copy, or you have to go to the archives, and then you can freely, they'll bring the records out and let you look at them. Other things have been microfilmed, and so although they have the originals, you generally have to use the microfilm. My great-grandfather was naturalized in the federal courthouse at 9th and Market in Philadelphia, which the regional archives was also in that building until it moved there a year and a half ago. So when I went to look, I had to use the microfilm. What I didn't know at the time was Those microfilms, also there are copies down here on Pennsylvania Avenue, so I could have just gone there. So it's good to look into what is there and what they have on film that you can look at elsewhere. Another interesting thing, and I've not found an answer as to why, when the World War I draft registration cards were finished with them, or they were done with them, they ended up in the Southeast Regional Archives, which is outside of Atlanta, Georgia.
All of them?
All of them. All of them for World War I. So all 4 of the registrations that were done. If you go down there and you ask them, they will let you look at the original cards. I went down because there's a difference in the ink that was printed, and although all of them have been microfilmed and are on Ancestry and Family Search and all, you really have to look at the card closely because the microfilm's in black and white, but some of them are in black ink, some of them are in blue, and some of them are in red. And the people who were at the draft boards were supposed to throw away the old cards when a new registration was taking place, but they didn't do that.
Thank
so
goodness.
you have to look at the date and look at the card, because for example, the second registration in 1917, which took place in August, has a red line about 1/4 of an inch thick across the top. Well, if you don't look at the date that they signed it, you may have that and think they did the registration in August when they actually did it in September on a card that was red ink.
And those draft registrations can tell you stuff that you wouldn't get anywhere else, like how tall were they, what color were their eyes, and who's the next of kin, and some other things that is wonderful information.
So you really have to with those examine them, and each regional archives, and they have a brochure that you can pick up down at the National Archives, but they all each have their website. If you go to the National Archives website, there are 4 boxes across the top. If you click on the one for Visit Us, that will bring up the list of where all the regional archives are around the country, and you can then click on it and it will give you a description of what their holdings are, and so you'll know.
Just to sort of interject this, if you can't find the naturalization in the archives, it's possible that never was a federal document. It was done in the state.
Yes.
So don't give up. Go to the state.
The thing you have to know is about when did they actually naturalize. If it is before the change in the law that went into effect in 1907, they could be naturalized anywhere, any courthouse in the country. After 1907, it was either only a federal courthouse, or there were county courthouses that did get permission, and they had to follow all the regulations. They had to file all the same paperwork. And so after 1907, you kind of have a two-place to look. My one great-grandfather came over in 1885, waited until 1904 to become naturalized, and he went downtown to the federal courthouse for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, which is the federal courthouse for the eastern portion of Pennsylvania, located there at 9th and Market, and that's where he was naturalized in. But he could have gone into any city courthouse in Philadelphia then and been naturalized. So you have to know a little bit about the law, a little bit about where they lived, and a little bit about the court systems that were around in there.
So my ancestor would have served after the Philippine insurrection. So how could I get some information about that military experience?
Anything after the Philippine insurrection, and this is part of the archive system, there is the Military Records Personnel Center out in St. Louis. And that is where the military records for anyone serving after the Philippines insurrection, and also men who were in the regular military, who this was a career for them, those records are out in St. Louis at that record center. The one thing I recommend, you can go to the website. There is a form that you fill out and you can order the records. If you want to go visit there, you can. I recommend, though, that you contact them ahead of time, because the records that you may want may have a problem with them, that they may be able or have to do something before they'll be able to allow you to look at them. For example, I had someone who lived out in that area do this for me. They were getting my great uncle's records from World War I and World War II. When they actually pulled the files, they were all stuck together. And so she had to wait 6 weeks while a conservator took care of unsticking the records before she could go get them.
Oh my gosh.
The other thing is, it's not a large facility, so it's a good idea to call ahead, tell them you're coming, and make an appointment, because they don't always have the capacity, if you walk in the door, to be able to allow you to do work right there and right then.
You know, that's good advice for any visit that you're going to make to any repository, is to call in advance and make sure that they're open, and
Yes.
and how to go about doing that, because different ones require different things. So there was a fire in the 1970s. What
Yes.
kind of records were?
Well, the greatest loss, and the majority of it, was the Army and the Air Force records. And so sometimes what people will have happen is they will write for the records, or they'll go there to St. Louis, and they will find out that there's nothing there. The good news is they are trying to reconstruct things. For example, we have a friend that she had contacted them to see what they had for her father for World War II. And they had nothing, but she mentioned she had some records that her father had kept and she now has. So they asked her to make copies. They started a file for him. So they are starting to do that. One of the other things is, at least if there is nothing there, you can contact the courthouse where soldiers from World War I or World War II would return home. They were strongly recommended that they set or give a copy of their discharge papers to the courthouse where they were going home to. So a lot of courthouses have these, and so that's a way of at least getting the discharge papers, which kind of gives you the basics of their time, when they went in, where they served, education medals that they got, and when they were discharged.
So that's for the military. What about people who, civilians who work for the government?
We also have in St. Louis, and my understanding, although the website, when I looked at it, gave different addresses, my understanding was that they were moving the civilian personnel records center into the same building where the military personnel records center was, but maybe they haven't actually accomplished that yet, because they did have two different addresses. But there is the Civilian Personnel Records Center for anyone who ended their service in 1951 or more recently. So if you had someone that worked for the government and they retired in 51, there is the Personnel Records Center for civilians that you can, again, order the records and all. Now, one of the things we didn't mention with the military ones, there are restrictions as to who can get what. And there's the same thing with the civilian ones. The website gives you all the details. If the person is deceased, then you have more possibilities of getting the records depending on your relationship, and you just have to prove that the person is deceased.
So are the presidential libraries part of this too? There's
Yes.
an awful lot of information there.
Yes. The presidential libraries fall under the National Archives. They are responsible for overseeing them. And we have every president from Herbert Hoover to George W. Bush who has a library. Barack Obama's, I haven't heard that it was officially opened yet, but when I looked at the website, it said it's not yet open for research. So you can't go to Chicago and visit his, but any of the others you can go, and of course, you know, there's the museum portion of it and all, but there is a research portion of the library that you can go and do research.
Usually those libraries are connected with the university somehow. We were just
Yes.
in Grand Rapids, and the museum,
For
Gerald
Ford.
Ford's was
Yes.
in Grand Rapids, but the library itself was in Ann Arbor because it
yes.
was near the university.
Yes.
So what kind of things might you research in a presidential library?
Anything that you might think that you might have a connection to a president. For example, I had a great uncle who used to tell us the story that when Truman was in Philadelphia, he would fill in for Truman. He would be the double for Truman, riding in the parades and things. So
Wow.
a couple years ago, I contacted the Truman Library to see if they could prove that, because I don't have a picture of him, but he was a dead ringer for Truman. And so I contacted them. They'd let me know. They looked, they couldn't find anything. They suggested that I contact the Secret Service because they more likely would have the records. So anything that you might have an ancestor who might have written a president a letter or something might be in the presidential library.
You know, the archives just is so overwhelming, but there's a whole lot there that we didn't even
Yes.
begin to talk about. And
Yes.
the things that we did talk about are more specific to individuals, but there's tons of stuff that where your individual might be named in some document. And so it's worth really going into the website and studying some of the things that are available.
And then just going to one of the facilities. And you know, if you're afraid to go, ask some of your genealogy friends. Somebody probably has been to one or more of the facilities.
Yeah.
They may even be willing to go down there with you.